Between the 1920s and the 1940s, cultural anthropology in the US, and Boasian anthropology in particular, appears as a collaborative field connected to a social milieu of writers, musicians, filmmakers, dancers, and scholars from a variety of disciplines. Franz Boas, who's also featured in this exhibition, is commonly referred to as the founder of cultural anthropology in the US. He was, as many of you know, a German Jewish intellectual who emigrated 1887 to the US, where he first worked as a curator and then in 1899 became professor of anthropology at Columbia University. And in my talk, I will be talking about the first generation of his students, as Tom mentioned, Edward Sapir, Ruth Benedict, and Margaret Mead, and their intellectual network of people. Their use of poetry, imagery, and music sheds light on an ongoing negotiation about the creation and medialization of anthropological knowledge. While all of them published poems in magazines such as The Dial and Poetry, Sapir moreover composed music, and Mead developed a strong interest in photography and film. For example, in their Bali field research during 1936 and 38, Mead and Gregory Bateson took around 25,000 photographs and 12 hours of film. They maintained a wide network of people with whom they worked on projects, discussed contemporary social questions, and developed methodological concepts. This cooperation created an analytical ground for broad theoretical and methodological questions concerning the concepts of culture, art, and time itself. The connection between the artistic and anthropological field is characterized by the crossing of boundaries, spatial, temporal, disciplinary, stylistic, generic, cultural, and personal, and at the same time by the constant negotiation of these very boundaries. In my talk, I would like to understand Boasian anthropology and the concept of cultural relativism as enmeshed in time and simultaneously producing time in a very particular mode, by which certain atmospheres are created. Thus, I've structured my following remarks by trying to grasp these different modes. And obviously, I rely in this research on many thoughtful historians of anthropology, such as Johannes Fabian, Richard Handler, George Stocking, Nancy Lutgerhaus, and James Clifford, who's also here today, and many more. I would like to understand these aesthetic modes that I will be talking about as knowledge practices which create anthropological data, as well as certain feelings and notions of time. This foundational period for cultural anthropology is also characterized by tension. I herewith understand the protagonist's various projects and works that include constant exchange and sometimes heated debates on creativity, expression, and art as a process of developing anthropological method, as well as an anthropological aesthetic. Moreover, the projects have to be situated as being part of the disciplinarization of cultural anthropology in the US. Interestingly, the making of the discipline was very much informed and shaped by collaboration taking place outside the academy. Approaching Boasian aesthetics and the phenomenon of historicity in a figurative way means to focus on relationships of interconnection and exchange that are all defined by relations of power. This means to acknowledge tensions, struggles, and contradiction. The Boasian urge to transform society into something better, their critique towards nationalism, racism, and discrimination between the 1910s and 1940s cannot be separated from their entanglements in colonialism, primitivism, and evolutionism. And Susanne has already talked about this ambivalences, which also play a role in my talk, obviously. And this is what I mean by being enmeshed in time. Clearly, countercultural practices were not free from reactionary or problematic content. So the figurative analysis enables to analyze them within their charged connectedness. In 1947, the filmmaker Maya Deren reflects upon her own fascination with anthropological questions. And on the way back, that whole discussion with S, who said maybe I would eventually abandon film and become an anthropologist, and my insistence that I would never be satisfied analyzing the nature of a given reality, but would want to make my own. And his answer that that attitude brought to anthropology might make a new branch of it. And my answer that perhaps in introducing the anthropological attitude into film, I was making a new branch of film. Well, maybe. Deren, who worked with Mead and Bateson, reviewed the film material Bateson and Mead had put together during their Bali fieldwork. In preparation for her own journey to Haiti to make films about trance rituals, Deren watched the whole 12 hours of Bali film material. Thinking in terms of figuration and entanglement, 3 points stick out to me. First, defining the practice of analyzing the nature of a given reality, and time one might add, as anthropological. Second, identifying the practice of making my own reality as artistic. And third, the motivation of making something new, speaking a new branch of anthropology and a new branch of film. Clearly the motive of renewal, of making it new by going to other societies and experiences other realities is a powerful one that lets anthropological and artistic practices overlap. And I think that's also a relation to your talk, this experience of wholeness, which is here at play as well. As we will see, the merging of anthropological and artistic practices stems from a particular understanding of culture. When looking at Mead's and Bateson's sensual methodological approach, one quickly realizes that there is a close connection to their theoretical concepts, for example, perceiving culture as an aesthetic whole. In their Bali research, they not only excessively employed photographs in 16mm film, but they also collected stories and fables, drawings and art objects, did interviews, wrote field notes, drew maps, collected children's drawings, and conducted psychological tests. Just with regards to the Bali material, the enormous scale of this material stored in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. is not remotely comprehensible. And in this excessive accumulation, we can see the attempt to capture every expressive aspect which was thought to create the culture. These can be found in stories, myth, ritual, and ceremonial actions, as much as in everyday activities and simple gestures. And I would like to quote Margaret Mead and Rhoda Matro from their manual study, The Study of Culture at a Distance, where they try to grasp the sensual approach. It is the contention of this manual that all cultural behavior is mediated by human beings who not only hear and speak and communicate through words, but also use all their senses in ways that are equally systematic to see and to project what they see in concrete forms, in design, costume, and architecture, and to communicate through the mutual perception of visual images, to taste and smell, and to pattern their capacities to taste and smell, so that the traditional cuisine of a people can be as distinctive and as organized as language. What we see here is a close relationship between cultural experience and aesthetic reflections. Aesthesis in this context of ethnographic methodology means both the close study of sensual perception and cognition, as well as the sensual aesthetic knowledge production. The acquisition of knowledge cannot be separated from its representation. The ethnographic gaze is already one that grasps in visualized and sensualized terms. Culture is perceived as an aesthetic whole expressed in various forms, and at the same time, culture is created by distinct visual and sensual practices that make that one culture unique. And here I'm showing you an image of Walter Spies, whose pictures you might have seen in the exhibition Hello World at the Hamburger Bahnhof right now. Spies and his artist colony in Bali were the first Mead and Bateson had contact with, and Spies provided the infrastructure for their research stay. And to give you an impression how there is an entanglement, how there is an entangled imaginative space, I would like to quote from Mead's Letters of the Field. Arriving on Balinese New Year's, the streets were empty, and Mead recapitulates her first impressions. With no people to distract us, we were able really to see the country itself, as it is hard to do when the roads are crowded as far as the eye can reach with picturesque and motley crowds of people and animals. And she goes on to visually capture the country as image. And a lovely land it is, with some 20 equally beautiful and different themes which repeat over and over in astonishing and unpredictable rhythms. The animals and the people all fit so well into this landscape that after one has once seen them together, it is a little hard to think of one without the other. The water buffaloes are a beautiful gray, rather like ashes of roses, and the young ones are actually pink when they are scrubbed. The little brown cattle are a neat fawn color, and the ducks with people drive in flocks are a softly gray-brown. And to pick up the notion of repetitive scenes which form a visual pattern, I'm showing you a plate from Balinese Character, which was a photo ethnography which Mead and Bateson put together after they had returned from Bali. And here you get an impression of forming these cultural patterns by assembling the single photographs they took to a picture tableau to make these patterns. And I would like to approach this method of pattern making through the eyes of Maya Deren, and therefore from her standpoint as a filmmaker. Deren describes pattern making as a filmic technique in her article Cinematography, the Creative Use of Reality from 1960. One can film different people at different times and even in different places, performing approximately the same gesture or movement, and by a judicious joining of the shots in such a manner as to preserve the continuity of the movement, the action itself becomes the dominant dynamic which unifies all separateness. So in the Bali material, for example, you see hours and hours of mothers bathing their babies. And this practice can be revealed as an anthropological practice of making patterns, and by these patterns, creating an aesthetic whole. You also get a sense of the notion of capturing the scenes with your senses by trying to fix them, which is at play here, so they can be analyzed by the anthropologist. Capturing here has also a violent side to it, as it also includes the construction of a certain aesthetic about Bali, which in some ways fixes the cultural other in this respective culture. The focus on repetition, repeating rhythms understood as a stylistic device creates those patterns and is driven by the desire to make them visible and at the same time to hold on to them. In the following, I would like to talk about this very specific attitude towards time among the Boasians. In her biography, Blackberry Winter, Mead recapitulates her decision to study anthropology. Anthropology had to be done now. Other things could wait. Time is a motor that drives salvage ethnography, an ethnography that tried to collect and record as much of the other culture because it was thought to vanish due to the influences of the so-called West. Here you can see the connection that now in capital letters belongs to Western time, which is firmly located in the present. But at the same time, now can also be perceived as a temporal concept which reflects that time itself is culturally produced. The capital letters show this reflexive understanding of time as well. In Balinese Character, Mead writes, "Meanwhile, we are faced with the problem of building a new world. We have to reorient the old values of many contrasting and contradictory cultural systems into a new form, and will transcend them all, draw on their respective strength and allow for their respective weaknesses, we have to build a culture richer and more rewarding than any that the world has ever seen. Now is the time in which we make the new world and the new time. This temporal attitude towards building a future and criticizing the present can only be explained by attending to certain configurations and to the countercultural positions early cultural anthropologists took part in. The so-called first migration, in which African Americans relocated themselves from the southern states to the US into the north and into bigger cities like Chicago and New York. And here we find the entanglements of the Harlem Renaissance and cultural anthropology, for example, in the works of Zora Neale Hurston, who was a student of Boas. Second, the Americanization debates and programs as a reaction to a perceived new migration, which tried to formulate a new American identity. The wartime and the urge to understand the enemy and their societies. And fourth, the rise of psychoanalysis and interpreting society through the predispositions of the individual. And I'm browsing through these configurations right now very quickly, but as you can imagine, and I hope we can talk about this in the discussion later, there is much more to say about this, and it's very complicated, obviously. In all these configurations, the Boasians played a public role and made their voices heard. The knowledge which they produced was already an engaged and involved one. Their research questions were driven by this urge to intervene and to be part in building a new world. The time of the cultural other, stored, captured, fixed in their respective culture, was desperately needed to rejuvenate the now of the US, and also this is a relation to Susanne's talk and this notion of vitalizing the own society via the cultural other. Ruth Benedict writes in her journal in 1934 about the quest of this cultural more and this feeling of being in a false present, to pick up a phrase from the exhibition. I wish I had lived in a generation that cultivated the spiritual life. Perhaps then I wouldn't have felt so frustrated. Perhaps one day the right environment will hit upon and a culture will arise that by its very nature fosters spiritual life that is nevertheless detached and adventurous. What might it be like? Chiefly a great sureness, experience out of which belief and existing had passed with all the other traits of temporality. Love that could recognize no private motive in its glad acceptance of whatever was unrolled before it. In Mead's description of the other culture in Balinese character, that what is missing in one's own cultural present is projected onto the other culture. And for the Balinese too, because of his primitivity, his unspoiledness, and his nearly complete harmony with nature, life is a holy fact. Religion is alive and there to teach life, the holiness of life. Art is here not something that it is outside life or outside religion. Here art is not art which one consumes like a sweet or a dessert for a change and to lighten the burden of a nearly unlivable life. No, life is what one can never enjoy sufficiently, and one tries by the prayer of art to accentuate the delight of light, to fix it in space or time. As you can see here, life is more. It exceeds the material world. It refers to something bigger and ungraspable, which is at the same time all-encompassing. This imagination of a genuine culture, to quote Edward Sapir, which can tap into and express this spiritual, drives the Boasian relativistic and holistic concept of culture. This kind of culture is perceived as art, and the cultural other as an artist, respectively. The notion of the primitive is not only something that is situated before Western time, but which is also a temporal promise for a future. Following this understanding, every cultural practice has meaning. Culture is art, and art is culture. Interestingly, such a genuine culture transcends time and cultural acts, or temporally speaking, moments, as it also relocates the anthropologist in time. This time concept can be revealed in the poem of Edward Sapir, which I've used for my title. A moment, there, don't move, eyelash, smile not blossomed quite, heel poised to settle on the floor. You're free to leave this moment for the next. It lives with me for all eternity. The conceptualization of the moment in relation to eternity can also be observed in the various materials which Mead experimented with. Writing poems on the back of field notes, photographing gestures, letting the camera record endlessly, collecting children's drawings, but also, for example, in Hurston's work, to write ethnography as a drama, to produce like ethnography as a dialogue is also one technique. This practices of assembling should be understood in a figurative way, thereby making these expressive, arranging, discussing movements of cultural anthropologists visible. All these practices try to capture this moment, which is a moment in which culture reveals itself as something more, as something transcending. This hoped-for future, this new world, is fostered by an understanding of cultural acts and practices that exceed and transcend the present and the time itself. And let me again speak with Ruth Benedict. It would be so amply foundationed upon verities that are not the sort of time and chance that incidents of faithlessness, of failure, of death would not touch its being. The many changes would have all departed, and these, to whom the life of the spirit was a reality, could pass in and out of the temple at will, their smallest acts lit with the radiance of their knowledge. It's a dream. So let me conclude here by saying that the artistic and poetic endeavors in form of writing poems, making films and photography, curating exhibitions, etc., are transgressing movements out of the old past into the new, the future, with a strong impetus for renewal, social change, and also re-education. Interestingly, part of the art anthropology figuration are collaborations between pragmatist thought and cultural relativism, which sheds additional light onto the notion of the future. Franz Boas worked together with John Dewey at Columbia University, and Dewey himself conducted an ethnographic research in a Polish community in Philadelphia. In Ruth Benedict's work, we find one connection between the culture concept and education. For culture is the sociological term for learned behavior, behavior which in man is not given at birth, which is not determined by his germ cells, as is the behavior of wasps or social ants, but must be learned anew from grown people by each new generation. Firstly, this concept of culture as learned behavior criticizes the race concept with its idea of biological aporia and programming. Secondly, it is a critique towards evolutionism that places different societies in a linear temporal order, and the West, obviously, as the most advanced. Third, here we find one of the connections to pragmatism. The impetus on learning propagates a new kind of empiricism, which assumes that the world cannot be explained via universal regularities, but rather that world is made via different acts and practices in different contexts, in different ways. And this is also the relative in cultural relativism. All 3 points have a strong temporal effect because they argue against universalism and constancy. So it is no surprise that also in Dewey's work we find the future as a concept and pragmatist thinking as anticipatory thinking. Learning does not only refer to learning within the culture that anthropologists investigated, but very much on learning within their own cultural contexts, which manifests in this contemporary question, what can we learn from primitive societies? Culture, and the primitive culture in particular, is conceptualized as a laboratory school, very much like the ones Dewey founded in collaboration with other parents and the University of Chicago, in which students can learn exploratory. And in Ruth Benedict's word, with a vast network of historical contact which has spread the great civilizations over tremendous areas, primitive cultures are now the one source to which we can turn. They are a laboratory in which we may study the diversity of human institutions. With their comparative isolation, many primitive regions have had centuries in which to elaborate the cultural themes that they have made their own. They provide ready to our hand the necessary information concerning the possible great variations in human adjustments, and a critical examination of them is essential for any understanding of cultural processes. It is the only laboratory of social forms that we have or shall have. The experiment is practical method, but also theory. Once conducted, it was thought to create new knowledge by questioning old one and possibly getting rid of it. And at the same time, the experiment stands for this new knowledge itself that is characterized as hypothetical, interventionist, and exploratory. Mead goes on to conceptualize the anthropological field as an experiment. And here, obviously, you can see all the negative implications and also violent aspects of primitivism, which constructs anthropological knowledge and knowledge about the other, which is exercised over the other as well. What method is open to us who wish to conduct a human experiment but who lack the power either to construct the experimental conditions or to find controlled examples of those conditions here and there throughout our own civilization? The only method is that of the anthropologist, to go to a different civilization and make a study of human beings under different cultural conditions in other parts of the world. For such studies, the anthropologist chooses quite simple people, primitive people, whose society has never attained the complexity of our own. And here you also see this, identity of the anthropologist as a teacher, and have in mind this is also the time where cultural anthropology is disciplinarized. So it's also forming this disciplinary identity. And we can see once more that the other culture becomes an educative space for cultural anthropologists. With this space, or with this spatial or temporal difference, one's own social forms do not appear as static and inevitable anymore, but changeable. Of course, the whole notion of the simpleness of the cultural other is highly problematic. Yes, yet it also creates the notion of the relativity of history itself, with a strong focus on culture and time as man-made, as creative and expressive cultural acts. And at the end of my talk, I would like to emphasize that I do not wish to offer an all-encompassing interpretation of the Boasian's relationship towards time. And this is the last part of my talk. There is a caption missing. Because of the positions, obviously, the Boas students had, they differ very much, and each of their researches forms a particular configuration. Instead, I would like to focus in the end on the ambivalences, which might tell us something about a certain feeling of time. First, there is this ambivalence between capturing the moment and leaving the moment behind towards the transfigured world and time. This becomes apparent in visualizing, grasping, and temporally fixing the cultural other, and the concept of striding through time itself and emphasizing on change, re-education, and the production of new cultural knowledge. So you might say it on the one hand, there is this static moment which you want to hold on to, but then there's also the freedom of leaving this moment and going forward. Second, there is the ambivalence between a golden past and, I would say, also a reflexive understanding of the regressive and reactionary employment of the past that you see in all those public interventions Boasians had, for example, arguing against racism, having a public voice in these very reactionary migration discourses at the time. And here we might see a transfer of the relativity of culture onto the relativity of time. Third, there is an ambivalence between the focus on form, expression, and pattern in their repetitive and unchanging qualities, and then the strong urge to break with old patterns, to make new forms and find new expressions. And this you can see in the various media they experimented with, and this is what Richard Handler has identified as the modernist sensibility of early cultural anthropologists. And in the end, you might say that one side of these dichotomies is assigned to the cultural other and the other to the Western anthropologist, and you're right by doing that. But if we understand these ambivalences also in terms of relations and relationships, not only with the other culture, but also with environment, with things, with stories, with emotions, all of which these anthropologists try to collect and curate, we can see them as imaginative, expressive capacities, which the Boasians in moments try to conceptualize as very much part of scientific knowledge production itself. Here we can situate these constant discussions about media, the creation of data and knowledge production, and in the end, the producing of worlds. So rather thinking these ambivalences in binary oppositions, I would like to approach them as an involvement and an enmeshment in politics of time, out of which its epistemic violence and its messiness arises, but also as countercultural critique. And as you all can imagine, looking at this complex relational network of power relations, I'm pretty much dealing with my own ambivalences, trying to approach Boasian thinking. Yes, oops, wait. This PowerPoint is frozen. I don't know, it doesn't work anymore. But there's a last slide which says thank you for listening.